Hello, angels. It's part 3 of a little series we're doing where we talk about the best albums of this decade that we are living through, the 2020s so far, approaching the halfway point in the decade, retrospecting on the 5 years past. And we have covered hip-hop, we have covered pop. Now it is time to take on indie. And the first big challenge with this is one that we didn't specifically face with the first 2 videos, which is defining what the fuck even indie music is or means in the first place. It is an astonishingly broad term, and so dialing in on which record is indie versus rock, which record is rock versus, punk or hardcore, or even the lines between some of those genres and hip-hop are kind of blurred. This was all difficult, but at the end of the day, I tried my best to use common sense. What that means is that our next video will be rock oriented and feature a variety of rock records, and I feel pretty comfortable in a lot of those assessments. And for this video, I'm trying to focus on some of the fundamental building blocks of indie, that being singer-songwriter music, folk music, and I suppose in its purest sense of the word, the term indie. I'm sure some people will quabble with some of my choices, but broadly speaking, I think if you expect an album to be indie, it will be on either this list or the rock list, and I really just tried to say, is this more of a rock album or more of an indie album? But the more I talk about it, the more I'm doubting my methodology, so let's just go ahead and get into this. And we're going to start, as we so often do, with a handful of honorable mentions. Indie being the category that was probably the toughest, the strongest competition. All 15 of these albums honestly could land on my albums of the decade so far list at the end of this whole project. It was pretty cutthroat. I had to make some pretty crazy cuts, and the fact that some of these records only ended up as honorable mentions is wild. And starting off the 5 honorable mentions, we have the righteous, roaring, life-affirming record of indie rock love songs from Torres, the excellent Thirstier. Another honorable mention, one of the most patient, serene, and therapeutic singer-songwriter albums I think I have ever heard in my entire life, Cassandra Jenkins, with an overview on Phenomenal Nature, though her new album this year, My Light, My Destroyer, could also slot in. And of course, how can we forget Animal Collective's Time Skiffs, the best record in over a decade from the beloved freak folk indie pop outfit, back in full form and absolutely killing it. And with the final 2 honorable mentions, we have Julia Holter's whimsical, winding, otherworldly Something in the Room She Moves, an interesting midpoint between a record like Aviary and a lot of the material she was dabbling with earlier in her career. And finally, Suzanne Sunfor returns after a very long absence with a delightfully indulgent, meditative, and incredibly rewarding series of muses on life and her past and her future that I have come to love quite a bit. So that's it. 5 albums, honorable mentions, out of the way. Let's get into the list. These are my personal, as of mid-September 2024, so don't judge me if the greatest indie album of all time comes out in the next month. Picks for the top 10 best indie albums of the 2020s so far. Starting with Blur and Gorillaz frontman Damon Albarn's turn to a second solo album, the incredibly beautiful and meditative The Nearer the Fountain, the more pure the stream flows.
In the beautiful past, left so desolate now.
Fans of Damon Albarn's other projects may not really understand what they're getting into with a record that is this gloomy, is occasionally this sparse. It's these expansive, chilling sonic spaces that both Damon's voice and the instrumentation he deploys so gently weaves its way through, exploring these vast sonic landscapes. I just love how big and empty this record feels, and yet so much of the instrumentation is so intimate. It feels like the nature that genuinely inspired almost all of its material. There's been a lot of complaints among people who are expecting something, I don't know, a little bit more peppy from Damon, that his solo stuff has been too dry, too dreary, but I have never been one to turn my nose up at minimalism, and this is a record whose nuances, whose cracks and crevices have always been really fascinating to me and consistently really rewarding as I revisit it over and over again. It's an album I liked right out of the gate, and one that I think I like even more now than I did at the time. Oh my god, how is this number 9? Fleet Foxes with Shore. I'm gonna swim for a weekend, warm American water. Fleet Foxes seemingly had quite big shoes to fill after their 2017 masterpiece Crack Up, an album whose versatility of instrumentation and composition is just huge. I think they made a kind of mature and calculated decision to follow that up with a record that is much more straightforward in a lot of ways. The journey that Fleet Foxes were going on to get bigger, wider, longer, denser kind of falls off the wagon here, but what remains is Robin Pecknold and Company's incredible knack for snappy, catchy songwriting, interesting, meditative lyricism, and just straight up infectious music. It always blows my mind when I listen to this album how catchy it is, how instantaneous it is. It is just a delight to listen to for a band that has occasionally faced some complaints from haters for being a bit of a chore, and, you know, I get it. This is such a breezy, blissful, beautiful little record whose polite rock and roll is irresistible. Number 8. I could get some shit for this. Not for how high this record is, but for how low it is, relatively. Sufjan Stevens, Javelin. 'Cause I really wanna know, will anybody ever love me? What a heartbreaking album. What a beautiful album. What an elegant maturation and continuation of what Sufjan began on 2010's The Age of Odds, an album that I have always loved, and yet, I don't know, I think Javelin, while doing less, manages to still kind of blow it out of the water. Of course, part of that has to do with a level of vulnerability that Sufjan has never really done before outside of Carrie and Lowell, and on that record, it is presented in an extremely intimate, captivatingly narrow sense. But Javelin is a big album. It touches on so much. The scope and scale of this record is so grand, the sound so ornate and immaculate, and at the core of it, Sufjan is just opening listeners up to his soul in a way that is so uncompromising, almost unbelievable. This album is vulnerable in a way that most music could never even dream to be. And what do we get for following Sufjan down that path? An extremely rewarding collection of deeply personal meditations set to, again, these ornate and immaculate indie instrumentals. This really seems like Sufjan's entire career come together around one truly awe-inspiring record, from the grandiosity of the instrumentation on Illinois to the vulnerability of Carrie and Lowell, the sonic palette of Age of Odds, even some of the mistakes made on Sufjan's last solo record, corrected, improved upon, and almost perfected on this album. It's amazing, and it's amazing that there are 7 indie albums I like more. This is goddamn ridiculous. Number 7, Jesus Christ. I'm gonna get raked over the coals for this one too. I can't believe neither of these are in the top 5. Another stunning indie effort, Spelling with the Turning Wheel. Yep, this album, basically the equivalent of a modern fairy tale. From its very theatrical lyricism, from the inspiration from the natural world and from folklore that goes into its instrumentation, to the vivid and vibrant sound palettes that it delivers. This thing is just like walking through an enchanted forest, and it is spellbinding every single time. From some of the most straightforward moments on the record, like the immaculate little deer, to some of the biggest and most uncompromising, like Boys in School, to the most abstract, be it Always, be it Emperor with an Egg. This thing is just one highlight after another, and the instrumentation is assembled in such a beautiful, touching way, and it all just revolves around this mythical, mystical, fairy tale world that Spelling has concocted for herself. And as she drags us through it, I cannot not smile and retain most of the refrains I hear along the way for several weeks after listening to the album. Number 6, Julie Byrne, The Greater Wings.
To carry you up on the greater wings.
This is going to be one of the less popular releases on this list. I think a lot of people know Julie and probably heard this record, but it didn't really seem to floor them the way that it floored me. I've always been a fan of Julie's incessant, meandering quietness, and it is so present on this record. Much like the Damon Albarn album we talked about at number 10, this thing is not afraid of space. Massive amounts of space, both compositionally and sonically. And while some people may read that space as nothingness, as emptiness, this is a record whose hollowed out moments really, really grab me. Some of the most beautiful and some of the most touching moments on this album are its most minimal, and they are just indulgent in a way that I find delightful, find consistently rewarding. Julie is a beautiful vocalist. She is a touching and subtle writer, and that comes through in both some of the most metaphorical ways on this record and occasionally the most exceedingly literal. But however she is approaching writing these songs, they are interesting, fantastical even. The songwriting on this record, I think, is deeply underrated. Yeah, you may want to have me tarred and feathered for putting this thing above Sufjan and Spelling, but in my opinion, every little detail of this album is just delightful. At number 5, wow, the newest entry to the list, Portishead vocalist Beth Gibbons with her incredible, amazing, long-awaited debut solo album, Lives Outgrown.
I'm floating on a moment, don't know how long.
I had a feeling this thing was going to be good because I had heard a lot of pre-release buzz about how good the record was, and I was head over heels for both of the singles that dropped. But wow, was I just not prepared for exactly how good this thing is. And I was surprised in how many different ways it manages to be good. This is far from a straight-up trip-hop record, though it does dabble and indulge in a lot of trip-hop sounds and do so effortlessly and effectively, but occasionally it is even darker, even colder than Portishead's darkest and coldest moments of their past. But with that indulgence, Beth also conjures lyrical fascination beyond what I've ever really experienced before with her music, and continuing to dig to those darker and colder places just yields such fascinating results. There are deep cuts on this record that I just can't get out of my head because they just don't sound like anything I've ever really heard before. And at the core of it is Beth Gibbons, this profoundly interesting vocalist and songwriter who is using these chilling expanses to weave her immaculate poetry into life as music. And yeah, it's awe-inspiring. It's astonishing. This is a remarkable album to put on and just lose yourself to for its runtime. And it being at number 5 blows my mind because, honest to God, this is one of my favorite albums of 2024. So the fact that we have 4 more records to talk about, it's kind of driving me crazy. And yet I cannot do anything else but just move on to the next entry on the list. That's crazy. Number 4, Bjork with Fessora.
When you're out of time, or how you look back changes.
Now, listen, it's no secret I'm a diehard Bjork fan, and I understand why even some diehard Bjork fans were not crazy about this record, from its strange gabber experiments to its weird nature-inspired soundtrack-style instrumentation, but man, all of that stuff just made me love it even more. Not that I ever expected anything else from Bjork, but it's kind of amazing, decades and decades into her career, how uncompromising her experimentation is. And on this record, she is just following her every whim in ways that I find utterly fascinating. Take the singles alone to see some of the record's most strikingly massive moments. Huge, dense compositions covering expansive ideas on her masterpiece Ancestress, and yet elsewhere on this record there is music that is just so much punchier, so much more grounded, and yet they exist together and weave throughout each other with the lyrical themes of nature and like mushrooms and shit really well. This is a bizarre album, even by Bjork standards. It is uncompromising, and I understand why it is not for everyone, but goddammit, I love this thing. And at number 3, a record that I think everybody kind of knew was going to be here, one whose reputation is solid gold and is already being mused on as the first great record of the 2020s in retrospect. You know it, I know it. Fiona Apple with Fetch the Bowl Cutters.
People like us, we play with a heavy balloon.
Yeah, this thing fucking rocks. It's incredible. I don't even know what I could say about it that would surprise anyone, that would provide any more valuable insight to this thing. Fiona Apple just emerging every once in a while, every 10 years or so, to deliver something magnetically and astonishingly beautiful. And I mean beautiful in both its most harrowing moments on songs like the Furious Heavy Balloon or For Her, and also some of its silliest. We definitely see Fiona Apple as an artist who is often deadly serious, but take a track like Shamika, it's a little tongue-in-cheek and playful, self-aware. I would even argue same thing with the title track, Fetch the Bowl Cutters. Or even a song that inspires as much whimsy and imagination as Cosmonauts. This thing is just fascinatingly versatile, and yet these songs fit together so well, and they're so remarkably consistent. So rare is a record that is able to cover as much instrumental and thematic ground as this, and have not only all of their songs feel familiar together, but to deliver a consistent and highly impressive standard of quality. It's clear just how long Fiona Apple spent perfecting not just the writing on these songs, but the sound, the style of these songs. And sure, there are a couple Laura Marling songs that sound a lot like Fetch the Bowl Cutters. I get it. But this album is still amazing. Truly an iconoclast. Number 2, talk about records everybody knew was going to be here. If you've watched any goddamn video I've put out this year, you've heard me talk about this record because I can't stop talking about this record. Vampire Weekend with The Only God Was Above Us.
I know that was for shack shape. This burning fast break is clean.
What the fuck? Like, I love Vampire Weekend, don't get me wrong. I've always loved Vampire Weekend. I am a huge fan of their debut. It was one of the first indie albums I ever fell in love with, and literally like 6 months ago, I called Modern Vampires of the City my favorite album of the entire year of 2013. Those 2 albums alone work to set the expectations that I have going into a Vampire Weekend record, which are quite high. And those expectations were impeded upon even more and increased even more with single after single after single from this record. Capricorn, Gen X Cops, Classical, Mary Boone, 4 of genuinely, honest to God, the best songs I've heard in 2024, and yet going into Only God Was Above Us, I still was not prepared for how good it is. I just can't believe it. It's every goddamn song on this track list, from the rambunctious opener Ice Cream Piano to the massive closer Hope, Pravda, probably the catchiest moment on the entire record, and The Surfer. I could just go on and on. It's 10 songs, and there are no misses. And in the process, I think Vampire Weekend even managed to improve upon some of the things that critics have often bashed them for, the trivial nature of their music. Not anymore. They cover some pretty goddamn serious subject matter on this record, and do so with music that is so uncompromisingly catchy. A song like Classical is kind of a miracle, in my opinion, given the ideas it's able to convey, the subject matter it is able to take on thematically, and yet, because the writing is so sharp and so precise, it is able to do so with insanely catchy, short, punchy refrains, one after another after another. Every moment of the song is so catchy, and yet when you dial back and think about what it's saying and what it's indulging in, it's incredible how much ground they cover. And occasionally that lyrical playfulness has been a crutch for Ezra, but here it isn't. He is choosing his words with more precision than ever, and they mean more, and they implore you to pay attention more than ever before. Vampire Weekend has always been great, but Jesus Christ, this very well could be the greatest thing they've ever done, and that's saying something, because I fucking love this band. Okay, so the people I talked to on Twitter justifiably said that they thought that Vampire Weekend would top this list, and I get it. They're the band that I have been talking about all year, but you'll remember that last year it was a different band. Single after single after single, I was head over heels in love with one particular record that stuck with me, and when it arrived, it was exactly as good as I was hoping for, and come the end of the year, it was the best thing I had heard. Of course, that record is the new Anoni and the Johnsons album, My Back Was a Bridge for You to Cross.
It must change. It must change.
For decades now, across various musical projects, I have loved what Anoni has put out, or at least I have loved what she has put out over decades in the time that I've been a music listener. But in my opinion, and I don't know how many people share this, I think this album kind of runs the table on almost everything else she's ever done. I love her previous release, Hopelessness. I think it is just an uncompromising scream of pain and frustration at the world around her, and yet in the years since, it seems, she has matured unbelievably to a point where she can release a record like this. And if you read my very long review of this album, all of these thoughts are there, and probably put more articulately, but I don't know, on this record, her anger and her disdain for the way that trans people are treated, the way that all marginalized people are treated, the way that the environment is treated, it's just as present, and in a sense, it's just as ferocious. But on this record, it is more calculated. The one thing that everyone thought to compare this to, of course, is Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, and for a lot of people, that may be jumping the shark a little bit, but I honestly see the through line. I think this is one of the greatest protest albums ever released, and because it chooses its words carefully, it disguises its anger and its virtue in these soul and R&B inspired songs that are just stunning. To me, of course, the writing first and foremost will principally be the thing that makes this record a classic, an all-time great, an upper echelon of all music I've ever heard. And yet, in addition to that, The instrumentation here, so poised, so delightful, so lively. It really feels like being in the room with the musicians on every single song here, from the gentlest, most inviting soul music to some of the rowdier, crazier, more compromising, loud, and divisive instrumental palettes on the album. And what can I say about Anoni as a vocalist that hasn't been said for years and years and decades now? She is stunning, awe-inspiring, uncompromising as a singer, and she doesn't have to be belting to the fucking rafters to do it. All over this record, like its lead single, It Must Change, there are quieter, softer, and yet more precise performances that are conveying the intimacy of her language and the meaning of it so fluently and so perfectly that it is astonishing. The fact alone that Anoni had so much to say and found just the right way to say it in both an inviting and inspiring way is incredible on its own. But the fact that she was able to perform it with the virtuosity that she and her collaborators are able to use to spin this into one of the most blissful, stunning, contemplative musical masterpieces I have ever heard will never not be amazing, never not be incredible. I think I will love this album with all my heart until the fucking sun burns out. And that is all I goddamn have to say about that. 15 indie albums. Let me know what I missed, be it Angel Olsen, Phoebe Bridgers, whoever. And I'll see you guys next time to talk about some of my favorite rock records of the decade so far. The shit that really knocked my socks off from the rock world. Looking forward to it.